So welcome everyone, and let's get going. I am Susanna Lorin, the Research and Innovation Officer at Funka. I've been the CEO of the company for 18 years, but these days I am concentrating more on my strategic assignments in accessibility, also working a lot in policy and legislation. I work for the European Commission as the leader of the WADEX group, the Web Accessibility Directive expert group, and I'm also one of the technical expert in ETSI Special Task Force 536, and we have been working with the EN standard that consists of the minimum requirements for the European directives. So that's what I do in my everyday life, except for, of course, leading my splendid team at the Research and Innovation Department of Funka. So just a little bit of background on what is happening on the European arena when it comes to digital accessibility. All regulations and initiatives in the EU when it comes to digital accessibility is based in the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UNCRPD. And this is sort of the basis of all the work at the EU level and also in most member states, because we have all ratified the UNCRPD. In the EU, there's also a disability strategy until 2020, really. This is the sort of goal year, and then there will be a new strategy forming. But until now, we have the existing disability strategy, which consists of different initiatives and projects and research, and also policy development and regulations. So that is sort of the umbrella work of web accessibility in the EU. And lately we have had three very interesting directives coming out of the EU. So the first one, which entered into force in 2017, is the Procurement Directive. That really changed the way public sector is procuring ICT when it comes to accessibility requirements. But this directive didn't turn out as strong as we thought and hoped, because it doesn't have a direct connection to the actual technical requirements. But it does say that whenever there is a EU regulation on this kind of accessibility requirements for ICT products and services, then it will be required to use it. And this is, ta-da, what is happening with the European Accessibility Act. So the directive that we're talking about today is actually also supporting the Procurement Directive. Then in 2018, we had the Web Accessibility Directive, which covers public sector organizations and other public bodies governed by public law. And that has just recently been a lot of focus on this, because one of the grace periods ended here in last September, just a couple of weeks ago. But today we are going to talk about the European Accessibility Act, which is now under transposition. So I won't be able to answer all your detailed questions. I know we have got some questions already on beforehand that is not possible to answer because the implementation acts are not there yet. The European Accessibility Act was adopted in 2019 and is now under transposition into national legislation. So we'll come back to that. So I think it's important to know that there are several different ways of or types of European legislation, and I won't go through all of them, but two different kinds are very important to remember. One is the EU directive, and a directive is a common law for all the European member states, but is need to be transposed into national legislation. All the accessibility legislation at the EU level are directives, and that means that they have a minimum requirement. So it's a baseline. All the member states need to apply the same minimum requirements, but the member states are also free to go beyond the directives. So the national implementation can vary a little bit between member states, but still we have the same baseline. If you look at a regulation at EU level, for example, Gdpr, many people know about that regulation. A regulation is directly applicable. So that goes just through all the member states in the same time, and it's all exactly the same in all member states. So there are different ways of doing this, but But the directives, they need to be nationally transposed, which means that we will still have a little bit of difference between some member states, because the member states do go beyond the minimum requirements of the directive, and they do it in slightly different ways. So we still have some differences. Even if the basic idea is to have harmonization, we still have some differences. So the European Accessibility Act. We have some periods and timing, which I think is important. It is right now under transposition, and it will be then adopted into national legislation in June 2022. So right now, all the member states are investigating how are we going to transpose this legislation? Do we need new legislation? Probably. And how does it affect existing rules and regulations? Because the act is really covering many different sectors, so it will affect many different parts of society. So there's a lot of analysis going on, and impact assessments and cost-benefit analysis and all sorts of things to make sure that this new regulation fits with what is already in place. And the law will then be, or the directive will then be enforceable from June 2025. So it's applicable from 2022 in the member states, and then enforceable from 2025, which means that is the date when the actual legal objects need to comply with the rules of the directive. There are some exceptions possible that the member states can decide on to extend this period of time until 2027, but the majority of the products and services that are covered by the directive has to be in compliance with the directive in 2025. There are specific grace periods for certain parts of the directive. So if you are providing services and you're using a certain product that was legal before the transposition happens in 2025, then you're allowed to keep using this until 2030, so another 5 years. And the same is true for if you have a service contract that is agreed before the transposition is made, then you can use it until they expire, but no longer than June 2030. For self-service terminals, they have a long expected life. So if they are in use when the law enters into force, then you can use them for the full economic life, so to speak, but there's a maximum of 20 years from when you started using the self-service terminal. So these are just the general grace periods in the directive. And who is covered by this? What is it really about? What is it that needs to be accessible? Well, manufacturers, authorized representatives, importers, distributors, providers of certain products and services. This is sort of the coverage of the Accessibility Act. So all of these organizations need to comply with this regulation. And the products and services, really the scope, if you divide it in products and services, it's computers and operating systems, smartphones, self-service terminals, and this can be ATMs, payment terminals, ticket machines, vending machines, all sorts of self-service terminals. And also digital TV and streaming services, ebooks and e-readers. If we look at the services, the scope of the services, we have emergency services that are covered, and the digital services of transportation, so not the transportation as such, but all the digital services around, which could be information websites or apps or ticket machines and so on. E-commerce and consumer banking services. There are further details around each of these, but this is sort of the broad perspective of what is really covered in the directive. There are specific exceptions, of course, like in all legislations, for web and app content. And if you know the Web Accessibility Directive, you will see some similarities here. So pre-recorded video or audio that is published before the transposition date, 28th of June 2025, is exempt. Also, documents published before the transposition date also are not covered by the directive. Online maps are also exempt, but if you have maps that are meant to be used for navigation, then you need to have an alternative. And that could be, of course, a description of how you find something instead of showing it on a map, or as a complement to the map. You can also describe the navigation process in another way, which is, by the way, very good to do anyway, because even if it's not an accessibility problem, there are many people out there who have problems reading and understanding a map. So it's a good idea to also explain the navigation. Third-party content is excluded from the directive, because if there is a third-party content that you cannot control, then you cannot comply, of course. So that's very obvious. And then archived material that is not updated after the transposition date. So if you have had material that you are not editing or updating or otherwise changing after 28th of June 2025, then it's seen as an archive, and then you don't have to make it accessible. So it's the same idea here as in the Web Accessibility Directive, that we don't look backwards. We only try to make sure that people do the right thing in the future. So from 2025, everything should be accessible, but you don't need to reiterate backwards, so to speak. And if we go into what is actually required, this is a long sentence, but I think it's important. We start with the products. Products must be designed and produced in such a way as to maximize their foreseeable use by persons with disabilities, and shall be accompanied by, where possible, in or on the product by accessible information on the functioning and on their accessibility features. So this is the first sentence in the general specifications of the accessibility requirements in the directive. So what it says is that the product must be accessible, but it should also have information about its accessibility and the specific functionality called accessibility features. So any extra add-ons, so to speak, that are covering accessibility. So that is what is required for products in a general sense. And if we look at the services, the directive says that the provision of services in order to maximize the foreseeable use by persons with disabilities shall be achieved by including functions, practices, policies and procedures, and alterations in the operation of the service targeted to address the needs of persons with disabilities and ensure interoperability with assistive technologies. So when it comes to services, there's a long list of parts of the services. So essentially what service we provide and how we provide it, and also making sure that the information around the service and the interoperability with assistive technology, all of that needs to be in compliance with the directive. So this is very general and broad, of course, but it sets sort of the standard of, or the scope of what the directive tries to achieve. And the accessibility requirements, they are very generic in the start. So they are general requirements that every part of the directive, every object in the directive needs to comply to. But there are then also sector-specific requirements. So for each group of products and services that are covered by the directive also have specific requirements, and then on the third level we go down to the specific products and the specific services, and there can also be detailed requirements of each of them. So it's a quite long annex where the requirements are specified, but if you are just interested in one product or one services, you can read the general ones and the sector specific, and then you go directly to this specific product or service, and then you have the full range of requirements. And the technical specifications of this isn't decided yet, because we are still in transposition and there are no implementation acts, but it would surprise me, and I think everyone else, if we ended up with anything else than the European standard for accessibility requirements for ICT products and services, which is the EN 301-549, because that is what is the minimum requirements of the Web Accessibility Directive, and it would be very strange if the Commission chose another standard, and I don't know which one that would be, or created another standard for this purpose. So most probably the EN standard will be updated or harmonized to fit in with the European Accessibility Act and used as the minimum requirements for the Accessibility Act. But it's not decided yet, and therefore I still want to say that it's the probable way. The enforcement of the directive will be made by in different ways in different products and services, because again, it's covering so many different sectors, so it won't be made in just one way, but several. So for products, there is the CE marking that will be used. There's also a requirement on declaration on conformity for both products and services. And there will be sector-specific monitoring. So if you again compare with the Web Accessibility Directive, you have national monitoring agencies monitoring all the websites and apps and documents. But here you will probably see that the member states decide to have maybe one monitoring for the financial parts, and there's probably another authority that has to do with transportation that could take care of that monitoring, and so on. So there will be specific monitoring bodies probably in most countries, depending on what specific sector we are talking about. Because again, there are so many rules and regulations and policies around each of these sectors. So it's important that the monitoring piece doesn't become too cumbersome for the member states. There is, of course, also a possibility for end users to come up with legal complaints if somebody is not complying to the regulations. And there is also a possibility for the monitoring bodies to work with penalties if manufacturers and distributors and all the others that are covered by the directive is not in compliance with the regulations. Then there is a possibility to fine or to give penalties to organizations. And the exact amount, the numbers here, is it as expensive as GDPR is the most common question I get, I think. That will be decided on the member state level. So it's impossible to say right now how much it will be, because it will again differ between the member states. So just to conclude with a little bit of advice or recommendation on how to, what to do from now to 2025, based on what we see that our successful clients are doing. I'm happy that so many people are asking about the directive already, because when the Web Accessibility Directive entered into force, the public sector bodies were sleeping mostly, and then they woke up when it was very late. So it's very encouraging to see that the private sector is much more on their toes, and they are already really working hard to make sure that they understand what the new regulations mean, and making sure that they can comply with all the regulations. So just some piece of advice before we close this presentation. It's important, of course, to know your current status. If you know, the goal is to comply with the regulation, or maybe to be the best in the world in accessibility, but still, need to know where you are. So some kind of analysis or audit to make sure that you know your current status is always a good way to start. And then it's really important to plan your work and to prioritize, because we see often that when you start working with accessibility, it can be really overwhelming, and you get reports with a lot of mistakes and fails, and it feels like, oh, I will never succeed with this. But you need to prioritize hard and make sure that you start where the users have the most problems. Some accessibility problems are more important or difficult for the end users than others. So make sure that you start in the right place and then move stepwise forward, and then it's absolutely possible to solve most of the problems, I'm sure. It's also, of course, extremely important to be clear in your requirements, both internally for your developers and designers, and of course also if you have suppliers externally, that they know what you mean. Don't just tell them it shall be accessible or it should comply with the EN standard. You need to really make sure that you and your supplier understand what is the goal here, what is it that you are requiring from them. And until you are absolutely sure that you are getting what you ask for, you also need to control that the deliverable is really fully accessible. We sometimes get a lot of sort of detailed inquiries, and people ask us exactly how to do this and that, and that's always, the granularity is always important. But I think in general terms, the internal process is the most important thing to succeed with accessibility. Because if you don't know how to cope with things or how to make sure that your everyday life works together with accessibility requirements, then you won't succeed. It's not a project. It's not something you start in October and end in December, and then you're fine. Then we sort of check, we did accessibility, and now we can move on to something else. That doesn't really work. It's a moving target, and you need to build it into your everyday workflow and make sure that your processes are working. That is, to me at least, the only way to really make sure that you are accessible and you stay accessible. It's also extremely important that you build internal competence. Even if we love to support our clients, it's not feasible that you are too dependent on external suppliers and experts. So you need to make sure that your own staff know what they are doing, at least on a basic level. That will help you so much, and it becomes much more efficient moving forward. So please do make sure to train your staff and make sure you build that internal competence during this period of time. And of course, when you do something new or something occurs that you haven't seen before, or you get a complaint that you don't know how to handle, then do ask for help, but do it when needed. I think that is better for everyone. And with that, my 20 minutes are up, so I will stop here and see if we can have some questions, maybe. So I'll just try to see. Yes, so we have a question here. Will the Accessibility Act cover telephone-related services, smartphones? And the answer is yes, it does. And what about audiobooks? Are they covered? Well, yes, I would definitely think so. I think there is a definition problem with this, but as we call them ebooks, I would say audiobooks, as long as they are online, I would say that's part of the directive, yes. How is e-commerce defined? Should commercial websites with product information be accessible, or only if they sell something online? Should the whole website be accessible, or just the web shop? Yeah, clever question. I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question, to be honest. Maybe if we are, we are just an ICT consultancy, but we also sell things online. I don't think that we are defined as e-commerce, but I'm not really sure how that will be, where the limits are. But what I do think that I can answer without lying is that the whole website must be accessible and not just the shop, because you can't expect people to understand, or if it's only the pick your product and go to the cashier and so on. If only that part is accessible, then maybe I can't choose what I'm going to shop. So I think at least the whole website needs to be accessible. But it's interesting to, I've had that question before, but I'm not sure if e-commerce is, Bart's own little shop, but he's only selling one thing, and it's not the basic, sort of the fundament of this website is not selling things. Next question is, based on a quick search, it seems the EN 301549 matches up pretty nicely with WCAG 2.1. Would you say that is correct? Yes. The EN 301549 covers more than WCAG, but when it comes to the web, it refers WCAG entirely. So that is the harmonization made between the EU and the US accessibility regulations. So that is, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, but we wanted to harmonize to make sure that we have global standards or global regulations that are in harmony with each other. So it's absolutely correct. But the EN 301549 also covers hardware and so on. So it's a broader standard, but when it comes to the web, it refers to WCAG. And the next question is, how is it related to WCAG 2.2? And until now, it's not. WCAG 2.2 is not a stable standard anymore. Yet. So we can't have a European standard that points to something that doesn't exist. So as soon as, when WCAG is moving, then the EN standard can be moving or following or harmonizing, and the other way around. But 2.2 is not a stable standard yet, so we can't really refer to that. And the question is, will you distribute this presentation to participants later? We usually don't in the free webinars we have. E-readers have to be accessible. Is that only hardware? E-books have to be accessible as well. What about software or apps to read e-books? I understand this as the software as well. But again, these details are not yet there, so it's an interpretation question, but I would think it's also the software. And the next question is, will also ads and marketing needs to be accessible? No, I would say no, if you mean ads and marketing in other marketplaces, so to speak, because third-party content is exempt from the directive. But if you have ads on your own website and you are in the scope of the directive, then of course your marketing and ads are covered. On the subject of securing internal competence around accessibility, do you have any advice for a developer who wants to deepen their knowledge on the subject? Any particular books or resources? Good idea. We can provide you with some links after. I am quite sure my colleague Charlotta will send every attendee a thank you email after this. Is that true, Charlotta? Will you do that?
That's very true indeed.
Okay, thank you. Then we can add some of the free resources that we usually don't want to recommend any of our, we have a lot of good colleagues in the industry, but if we recommend one, then we feel we need to recommend the other one and so on. So, but any free resources, we are absolutely fine to point you to, and of course also the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, which is a member organization for anyone interested in accessibility. They have also a body of knowledge, free resources, and of course my recommendation would be to try to get certified by IAAP, because that is really the best path to make sure that your developers are in line with what is required, and you can sort of trust their knowledge. But I'll be happy to provide you with some links. W3C also have good free resources online. Next question is, do you know why the health insurance and education sector are not in the non-public legislation? Well, there are many things that are not in this legislation, and that is it's a long process. Many of the disabled persons organizations have been very disappointed about the Accessibility Act, because there were things in the proposals in the beginning when we started discussing the directive that didn't make it until the end. So there are many different bits and pieces, and it's a negotiation between the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council, and then with all the member states. So the things drop in and out of legislative processes all the time. It takes a long time. I can't really say why exactly these specific sectors didn't make it, but it's a long discussion, and many different many different actors and stakeholders who fight in different directions. The information about the accessibility itself, that should be on the site. Are there any good examples of how to do this? Well, I am quite sure there will be some kind of template in the implementation acts, because we do have a template in the Web Accessibility Directive, and I think that is a good place to start, because probably it will be similar. There are also something called VPAT in the US that you can look into. That is usually a good way to produce accessibility information on or documentation on products, and there are also some good examples already out there when it comes to the Web Accessibility Directive. So if Charlotta can write down what I'm saying now, I can also provide some links in the email afterwards. There are good examples, absolutely, but I also think there will be some kind of template around this. Is this directive for all products and services or for just some certain areas, like for the tax authority and not for, well, I think this is maybe a misinterpretation of the directives, because we have the Web Accessibility Directive that covers public sector. That is another directive. That is something that I haven't covered today, but that is the tax authority that this person is talking about. They are covered by the Web Accessibility Directive. Biltema, which is a Swedish commercial site, is, as far as I know, not covered by this, because I think they are only selling car parts, but I may be wrong. And then they are not covered by this. So there are the European Accessibility Act covers certain products and services, like computers and e-commerce and banking services and so on that I mentioned before. So there's a long list of products and services that are covered, but there are also many other things that are not covered here, and car parts is not in the scope of this directive. And the next question is, are mobile apps a part of the Web Accessibility Directive from 2018, or is that not included until the European Accessibility Act is in place? Well, again, there are different legal objects that are covered by the two directives. So the mobile apps are part of the Web Accessibility Directive, but they don't need to comply with the directive until the 23rd of June next year. So that is the last grace period of the Web Accessibility Directive. So public sector apps need to comply with the Web Accessibility Directive in June next year. That has nothing to do with the European Accessibility Act. That is something completely different. So the private sector organizations that are covered by the European Accessibility Act, certain products and services, that the apps are also included there, but the application period is they're not enforceable until 2025. So there are two different things, and don't mix them up. But the apps in public sector, they need to comply on the 23rd of June 2021, so next year. What could be a reason to get a fine or penalty? Well, two reasons. One is that if you are covered by the directive and the monitoring agency is making an audit and they see that you do not comply with the regulations, then they will probably say, hey, you need to do this and that, you need to remediate, and you have a period of time until you need to answer to that or remediate your website. And if you don't do that in a timely manner, if you don't, or if you say that we don't care, or I don't know, you can say anything, but if you don't adhere to the request in a timely manner, and maybe they then ask you again, and you know, but if it takes too long time and you don't really do as you're told by the monitoring agency, that could be one reason for a fine. Or if you have an end user who is complaining about your lack of accessibility and you don't provide any services or alternative format, you don't try to accommodate in any way, then you can also potentially, I mean, it will first be a lot of discussions and audits and tests and so on, but in the end, it could be a penalty if you don't comply with the regulations. It's not like you're not in compliance and then bang, you're fined. It still needs to be either monitored or complaints, and then there is a process, of course, of trying to understand, is this disproportionate burden, or should it be accessible? Is it accessible? Experts need to be involved, I'm sure. And then if you still don't do as the monitoring agency is asking you to do, then there could be a penalty, or if it takes too long time. Since the national states need to transpose the Accessibility Act into national law, how large do you judge the wiggle room for them, and how much deviation do you expect we will see there? Wiggle room, I love that. Well, there's no wiggle room downwards. There are minimum requirements, and the only thing you can do is go beyond the minimum requirements. So I don't know if wiggle room is really the right word there. But if you just, I mean, the only thing we can really compare with is the Web Accessibility Directive. And I just wrote about this yesterday. I should remember it by by heart, but I think 10 or 11 member states have broadened the scope of the directive, and another 5 or 6 or so are extending things when it comes to monitoring or the accessibility statement and so on. So around maybe a third or half of the member states will probably make some deviations one way or another. But as it's only possible to go beyond the minimum requirements, I think that is only positive, because that means that the member states want to do something that is even better than what is required in the directive. But really, I'm just guessing now because nobody knows. But that is just based on what is happening with the Web Accessibility Directive. I think we can see there will be differences. What are the supervising or overseeing agencies in Sweden that ensure the implementation of enforcement after 2022? Good question. And that is not only relevant in Sweden, but in all member states, of course, but we don't know yet, because there is in most member states, I mean, the transposition has just started, and some are even slower than Sweden, but still the analysis and investigations are just going on right now. So there are discussion in different groups representing the different sectors and so on. And when it comes to Sweden, it's May next year that this study will be presented to the government, and that is in this report. There will be, hopefully, there will be suggestions on which monitoring agencies to appoint to this. But until, I mean, now it's still under analysis and discussion, so nobody knows. Can you tell a bit more about the standard EN 301-549 and how does it intervent with the Accessibility Act? Well, the EN standard is one of the world's most broad and comprehensive ICT standards on accessibility. It was I forgot the word. It's made on upon request from the Commission. It was it has been going on for a long time. The first decision was made in 2004, and then in 2008 we started the work, and then we're still going. So, you know, standards it's not a fast-moving thing. It was first created to underpin the Procurement Directive. So it was written to support procurement of ICT products, accessible ICT products and services. And then in the next version, or the next generation, so to speak, it is now the minimum requirements of the Web Accessibility Directive. And that is why I am quite sure that it will also be the basis of the European Accessibility Act. In Europe, we have the legislation says how things are going to, what is going to be accessible and when it is going to be accessible and so on. But the technical specifications are not written into the legal texts. And that is very clever because the technological development moves so fast. So it's better to have that in a separate document, which is a technical standard that can then live its own life. And we have already more versions of the standard, while the legislation is sort of stable. So that is a way to make sure that we have the law in one hand and then the technical specification somewhere else. And the technical specification is based on the European standard that is called EN 301-549. It's a long document, but at least it's very well worked through. I'm part of this, so I'm now talking. But I think it's also, it's used in other countries than in the EU, and it's also harmonized with the US regulations and so on. So it is really one of the most well or worked through standards in this area. And because it covers much more than only the web, it's also one of the broadest standards. And I hope it will have a long life and that it will support many of these directives. And I have been promoting the standard all over the world, and it is also used in South America, it's used in Africa, it's used in Australia and so on. So it's really, and Canada. So it is a well-working document in many ways. And it's also free, by the way. It's just downloadable. You can get it for free, which is a good thing. Are content management systems, intranets and CRM tools also included? That is a very good question, but I would not say so. It's really not that well defined in the directive text as such, but they are not mentioned, so I wouldn't think that they would be included, no. Do you know whether there will be deadlines to set up national monitoring authorities? Some countries still don't have any for public sector yet. So now we are maybe talking about the Web Accessibility Directive. I know there are some delays, and I know also that there are member states who have been fined for transposing very slowly. But when it comes to the Web Accessibility Directive, I haven't seen any specific dates for that. I don't think there is a deadline, but I mean the real important deadline is when the member states need to report back to the Commission. So if you don't have a monitoring agency, then you can't monitor and therefore you cannot report. So I think that is sort of the sharp deadline, but you need to count backwards from that. And in most of the member states that didn't have web accessibility legislation before, they are struggling with competencies and finding experts and recruitments and tools and all sorts of things. And I think even if you have started working long ago with this, they are still short of time. So for the countries who still haven't really pointed out the right monitoring agency, I think they're in a hurry for sure. But really the only deadline that I know of is the reporting date, which is end of 2021. Is the Web Accessibility Directive going to be the standard that's most applicable to the space around components for online learning and education, or will the European Accessibility Act add in anything for that sector? That is a good question. Online learning and education. I don't know. I really don't know, but I hope that no matter which directive is sort of the baseline, I think still the EN standard is a good place to start for learning and education. So I hope that will be the case, but really none of the directives is sort of really targeting this this sector for various reasons, among others that there's so many other regulations around education. But it's a very, very interesting question, and I really don't know. I'm sorry. And then we have a question about WCAG 3.1 and when it will be ready, and I am not prepared to answer to that. I'm not part of that expert group, so I think there is a lot of good information in W3C's website around this, and we also have Shadi Abuzara talking at the Funka Accessibility Days at the end of November, so you can listen to him there or just look it up online. So documents that is published before before June 2025 don't need to be accessible, even if it's important information for the customer. Yes and no. If it's you have to have some kind of cutoff date when the legislation is not supposed to be retroactive. So the date here is really that the documents that are published before June 2025 doesn't need to be accessible. But I mean, if they are really needed for the client to perform services or something like that, then of course that would be silly not to make them accessible. But there's always a cutoff date, and you can always discuss why isn't this covered and why isn't that covered. But that is how the directive is written, and that is sort of the deadline or the date. And tips on where this is described in an easy to understand way. dates and so on. Yeah, I wish I could point you to somewhere where the Accessibility Act is described in a good way. The really overall things is described very easily, I think, in one of the Commission websites, which is unfortunately impossible to find because the navigation is so complicated. But we can provide a link to that information. It's not so detailed though, but really I would, if you are interested in the details, then I would really recommend to read the actual act, because it's not more than 50 or so pages, and it feels a little bit hard in the beginning, but it's really quite clear when you start reading it. So it's not impossible to get through the directive as such. It's not as legal as it, legal documents can be really, really hard to, but you don't need to be a lawyer to understand the act. And remember to forget the first pages and start when the articles come, because it's articles that is the actual directive. The other thing you can sort of skip. But I wish I had a good link to give to you. Maybe we need to create that ourselves, but I haven't seen one yet. I'm sure it will come though. And we have, will public services be affected? Again, public services are affected by the Web Accessibility Directive, but the public services will not be affected by the Accessibility Act more than indirectly, because when they procure computers, for example, and the computers need to comply with the directive, then of course the bonus of the public sector body is that the things that they procure will also be accessible, but they are not directly covered by this legislation. They are covered by the Web Accessibility Directive. And then we have a question about social media. And it's just, what about social media? So that is a little bit unclear, the question, but is it covered or not is what I interpret it as. And the answer is no when it comes to the European Accessibility Act, because third-party content is not covered. So you can't expect a company who is providing services of some sort to also really affect Facebook and tell Facebook what to do, because that's not how the world works. So if you are publishing content in social media, you can't really, you can't control the accessibility, and therefore you also can't comply. My personal recommendation, or our recommendation, is always that if you, please do use social media, of course, but if you have really important information, please remember that not everyone is on social media, and maybe you can't control the content. So it's also important to have really key messages also in a channel that you can control yourself. So see social media as an add-on and another way to reach people, but make sure that the information is also possible to get hold of somewhere else. Oh, there are too many questions. Will built environment be included in that eventually, or is it permanently postponed? Permanently postponed, that's good. Well, that is one of the things that were in the proposal of the directive from the beginning, but then fell out during the way. So the built environment is not covered by the Accessibility Act, and this is a guess from my side, but I don't see that it would be included after a while. I think we need to wait for a new directive to cover all the things that didn't get into the directive, because the directive is so focused on the IT or ICT part, and it would surprise me if it would be revised to also cover built environment. But nobody knows. I can't promise that will be the case, but my guess will be that it's more likely that we see other regulations or directives covering the built environment accessibility. If we at all do that at the EU level, I don't know. One of the reasons that it fell out is that there are so many different contexts and situations in the member state. It was really hard to make it into one size doesn't really fit all when it comes to the built environment. Does this directive require accessibility through universal design? That is a good question. no, I would say. But universal design is also something that you can always debate among experts. What does it exactly mean, and so on, and how do you define it? But the Accessibility Directive is pointing to specific technical requirements that I don't think that anyone can interpret as universal design requirements, but specifically accessibility requirements. And there will be technical specifications for accessibility, and also there are the functional performance statements, and the sort of use cases and user scenarios are really based on accessibility. So I wouldn't interpret it that way, which is of course a pity in many ways, but it's still, we are at least moving in some kind of direction here. How this directive relate to the accessibility of private and public transportation? Well, it only relates to the information and digital services of transportation, of transportation companies or transportation providers. So not the actual transportation, not the trains or the buses, but the way they sell their tickets and the way they inform. So just the digital services part of transportation. Can individual consumers make a claim against a company under the Act in national courts, or shall there be an intermediary that is an organization that represent users more broadly? Well, this again will be decided on a member state level, but the idea is that you have some kind of monitoring agency and you have something like an ombudsman or something like that, which would then be, I think, what you are referring to as an intermediary. So you don't have to sort of take the company to court yourself, but you are complaining to an organization, an authority that is then auditing and making sure that this is happening. And we should not try to be too similar to the US when it comes to this. No other references to the US right now, but really litigation is not the way we are trying to make this work in Europe. We have a completely different tradition, and it's another way of doing it. So this is not, the idea is not that this needs to go to court to be solved. I mean, it's quite the other way around. So it's a monitoring agency, and then it's an ombudsman or another agency that is helping and sort of solve the problem, so that we keep making the companies do things better rather than fine them. So that, I think that is the, but yes, there will be an intermediary, but that is decided in the member states. So if we compare with the Web Accessibility Directive, some member states have a monitoring agency and who is doing the monitoring, and another agency doing the taking care of the complaints and so on, and some even have a third one with doing the reporting, and some of the smaller countries have only one agency doing both. So both monitoring and taking care of complaints, and so there are many different ways of doing this, and it also depends on the legal tradition of the member state and the size, and if they are federal and so on. So really there are differences between all the member states. So the monitoring agencies have to check for compliance or report on compliance to the EU. Yes, both. The monitoring agencies need to monitor, and they also need to report to the EU. So they do both. They monitor and they report. That is the same in both the Web Accessibility Directive and the European Accessibility Act. It's very similarly written. How about communication online? Do you recommend anything? I see that you're using Zoom. Is it better than Skype or Teams from a WCAG point of view? Oh, that's a big question. Yes and no. We usually try not to recommend things because, again, we need to be independent. And if we do recommend one thing, then people interpret it as the others are bad, and that is usually not the case. There are several reasons why we use Zoom. They do have a lot of good accessibility features built into them, but it's also that it works for many of our clients and it works well for us. It has really been very helpful during this period of time, during the pandemic. There are also other good products, and we do use Teams, and we do use BlueJeans and Google Hangouts and GoToMeeting, maybe first of all GoToMeeting as an alternative to Zoom. So there are pros and cons of all of these, and they are some of them are a little bit better than others in accessibility. But like right now, we are not using the features, the accessibility features of Zoom, because we are doing like a fake captioning with another with another product. So it's also, we are not always using everything in the way it's intended. So I think you need to try what is really useful for you. We have had some problems with Teams, for example. We use that internally, but as soon as we invite people from externally from other organizations, then it starts creating problems. So it's not really an accessibility problem, it is more of a sort of general technical problem. So I think it needs to be tested and make sure that everyone is happy with the result. I know there are some comparative studies done by different research organizations. So let's see if I can find one of those in English and maybe include in this famous email where I'm now promising many things. But I know that people did do comparison of this. Will the private sector need to have an accessibility report published as the public sector has? Well, yes, not exactly the same, because it doesn't, the name is not an accessibility statement, but some kind of conformance report needs to be there. Yes, we don't have the template yet, but yes, there will be something similar. Some website owners make inaccessible websites, but then add a widget to include some accessibility retrofitting. Is this acceptable, or should websites meet the standards for all users by default, please? Sorry. Well, I can't answer to all of this retrofitting, because there may be something out there that I haven't seen and that actually works. But from the like 120 or so tools like this that we have seen, I would say no, it doesn't work. It's not enough, and really it's fake news. There are no shortcuts in accessibility. You need to make it work from the beginning. Again, I can be wrong, but from what we have seen, I have never experienced something of these sort of overlay products or services that actually work. So I don't know, I doubt it. Could be, it's a fast moving target, so maybe. So 1 minute to go. Will Norway follow this even though we are not a member? Yes, Norway does. Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein are part of the EFTA group, and you cannot vote in the EU, but you do comply with our regulations. So you got the a very interesting position. You are also going to be covered by the Web Accessibility Directive. That is no, but you are not transposing in the same speed as the EU member states. But yes, you will be covered. Absolutely. It just takes a little longer. So if having a service that isn't compliant, and I know that already since I have made an accessibility audit, can I still state at 2025 that I can use the grace period? I need to understand this. If having a service that isn't compliant, and I know that already since I have made an accessibility audit, can I still state at 2025 that I can use the grace period? No. The grace period is not that I need a little bit more time, please. That is not the grace period. The grace period is just that, or the periods is really specific sectors like self-service terminals. The legislator knows that they have a long economic lifespan, and therefore they don't want people to throw them out of the window before they have, they need to be used for a longer time. So that is the grace period is stated by the directive and says that you have more time for this and that, but you can't claim that I need more time and therefore I need the grace period. That is not how it works. What you can do is that you can claim a disproportionate burden and say that because this system or this part of my website or whatever it is takes an enormous amount of time to fix, and it is so resource demanding that I can't do it until I update the system or whatever. You can have a claim on undue burden. That is what you can do, but that is not the same thing as the grace period. So friends, it's 2 o'clock already. Thank you very much for this. We still have many open questions. I'm sorry I could not do this faster, but it was really good to interact with you. And I hope that you are now curious and interested in learning more about the European Accessibility Act and accessibility as such. Please do reach out if you have any more questions, and I hope you will also join us for the Accessibility Days by the end of November. It's fully online now in the pandemic. And keep up the good work and have a good weekend, all of you. Bye-bye.